The UFC is single-handedly killing the sport of jiu-jitsu, and at this point, it feels like there's nothing we can do to stop it. The new TV show UFC BJJ, Road to the Title, has set a very dangerous precedent for the sport of jiu-jitsu in the modern landscape of combat sports. Now, the show posited itself to be a jiu-jitsu version of the reality TV show The Ultimate Fighter, which is an interesting concept, one I have mixed feelings about. I was pretty disappointed in the selection for the first season's coaches, for one. I had never even heard of Rennes and Gabriel before the show. I was upset that they didn't get Gordon versus Mikey like they had initially pitched. And by episode 2, they were already arguing over ecological jiu-jitsu, which is a terrible way to win fans. I'm sure 30 people have already clicked off this video right now just because I used the words ecological jiu-jitsu. With that being said, I do like that it's free on YouTube. Hopefully, they're doing that as a pilot to potentially get The Ultimate Fighter on YouTube in the same format. And it promises to help build and expand the sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the mainstream, which is all well and good, don't get me wrong. I think that's admirable, but herein lies the issue. Jiu-Jitsu isn't what MMA is. Mixed martial arts is a rule set, not a singular martial art. You would never claim to have a black belt in MMA, because MMA isn't something you can define as a singular discipline, like any other individual art could. Another good example of this concept would be Sambo. Sambo is not a martial art, but it is a rule set, and it uses different martial arts within that rule set. But what does this have to do with anything? Well, these jiu-jitsu athletes are being signed to exclusivity contracts. These contracts restrict them to only competing under the UFC banner and within the UFC organization. Prior BJJ competitions hosted by the UFC attracted high-level competitors like Gordon Ryan or Helena Cravar on UFC Fight Pass, and they hosted these competitions under the UFC banner and provided a high-level venue for BJJ competition and allowed for some pretty entertaining matchups, especially ones involving active UFC fighters, which, while these weren't necessarily the highest level competitors, they were very fun to watch. This is all well and good, but now if an athlete wants to sign and join this, they're required to forfeit their ability to go compete in other events. This means no ADCC, no karate combat, no CJI, not even IBJJF. And this is horrible for the sport. Now, you might wonder why, and like I was explaining, jiu-jitsu is not a rule set, it's a martial art. And these competitions, ADCC, CJI, IBJJF, are not promotions, they're events. ADCC is an Olympic-style event, for example, and it happens annually. The opportunity to medal at ADCC is a very significant opportunity in a jiu-jitsu athlete's career. And events like ADCC are what can help get the sport of BJJ added to the actual Olympics. So while reducing the talent pool only hurt the sport as a whole. You no longer have the best guys against the best guys, which means fewer eyes on the sport as top matches get blocked. ADCC and CJI aren't even really competing with Fight Pass either. That's the weird thing about this whole thing. Because like I said, they serve as events, not promotions. They only happen once or twice a year. They don't have a main promoter. There's no Dana White of ADCC. And they're not regular competitions. In the UFC, we see belts defended on a regular basis in different weight classes with reigning champions who are challenged for their active title. In ADCC or CGI, these competitions happen year to year, with a new champion being crowned for that year each time, and with a silver and gold and bronze runner-up like you would see in the regular Olympics. The only entity that was legitimately competing with the UFC in their own format was ONE FC, which didn't even sign the same type of exclusivity contracts, because it still allowed their competitors to go into events like ADCC or IBJJF. But ONE FC nearly lost all of its high-level competitors following its own controversy. You see, Mikey Musumeci was initially slated to grapple against Cade Rotullo in a BJJ super fight that would have been very exciting, with Mikey moving up 2 weight classes from 135 pounds to 170 pounds, challenging Cade for his title and for double champ status. Mikey obviously put on a lot of size for this matchup, but unfortunately, Ruotolo was forced to pull out due to an injury 3 days before the fight. When that matchup fell through, they subsequently rescheduled Mikey on 3 days' notice to defend his own title at 135 pounds, down 2 weight classes. Now, keep in mind, ONE FC supposedly enforces hydration testing and bans water cutting. With that, they decided to schedule Mikey for a matchup that would require him to cut 35 pounds in 3 days. And before I go on, I just have to say, what did they think would happen? Did they expect him to cut a leg off? I mean, that's ridiculous. They knew full well he was weighing 170 3 days before they wanted to make him 135 to defend his own belt that he won on short notice. What was he supposed to do other than water cutting? How was he supposed to make 135? Chatri's only explanation was to say that it was Mikey's choice to go forward with the rescheduled matchup and that he insisted that he could make weight. Mikey was completely quiet on the matter, merely apologizing to his fans and his opponent for failing to make weight in an Instagram post. Regardless, Mikey was stripped of his title due to missing weight and failing rehydration. Keep in mind, he only knew he was to defend his belt 3 days prior to the weigh-in, and they still stripped him. Following this mistreatment, he immediately left ONE and signed with the UFC, which is great. The way ONE treated Mikey was disgusting. I'm glad he's got a good opportunity with the UFC. I'm sure they pay him very well. But now we have the issue with contracts. Mikey was the first ever exclusive UFC BJJ athlete, which, as I said, I'm sure is great for him because he probably gets quite a big paycheck to be the first ever exclusive UFC BJJ athlete. But they're signing other athletes under the exact same type of contracts. Craig has taken great issue with this, as he rightfully should. Craig didn't seem too thrilled when he learned that the competition format basically copied CJI. From the pit that they use to the scoring criteria they use, the reality is, though, there's not much that Craig could do about that. Trying to get royalties from that is like trying to say your competition is the only one allowed to use mats and rash guards. But Craig is understandably upset because it's like, well, if you're going to steal my rules, you could at least have the courtesy of not stealing my athletes and allowing them to compete in my event too, which only happens once or twice a year. That way, everyone can make more money and enjoy a cool new rule set. But no, the UFC wants to treat Craig and CJI like a competing promotion rather than an event and try to ice him out. And well, the CJI may be able to survive this, and the ADCC most definitely will. This is terrible for the sport. Keep in mind, UFC fighters who are signed with MMA contracts would be allowed to compete in those events and have in the past, but not the best BJJ practitioners that the UFC will be signing. And big names like Craig Jones or Gordon Ryan are never, ever going to sign a contract like that. So we're not going to get them in the UFC BJJ arena either. And that brings us to the worst part of this. There's nothing we can do about it. Craig Jones can't do anything. The scoring criteria isn't really something he has a legal case to go after, because that's like trying to copyright the sport of jiu-jitsu itself. It's not something you're going to be able to do effectively legally. And he can't go after their use of the pit because he doesn't actually own the pit. He only has a licensing agreement from Karate Combat. Karate Combat could attempt to bring a suit against the UFC for infringing on their pit design, but the UFC isn't stupid. They knew they could make their own design slightly different, and it wouldn't be much of a legal avenue to pursue. Now, maybe theoretically, if we switched the pocketbooks of the UFC and Karate Combat, there would be something that could happen, but you would need a very, very solid case to take on an entity like the UFC, and they really just don't have one. So we're going to see a serious decline for the big stages of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I doubt we can expect the UFC to do the responsible thing and loosen their exclusivity contracts, and unless someone wants to pay Jiu-Jitsu athletes very well to compete regularly, these athletes aren't going to turn down UFC money, even if the UFC money is an optimistic 10K, because UFC money is consistent. It's not a once yearly tournament that happens that they may or may not win. So while I hope I'm wrong, I think we can expect to see a significant decline in the popularity of the sport of jiu-jitsu over the next few years, if not a decline in the sport overall.